Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we dig into the research that matters, giving you the core insights without the clutter. Today, our mission is pretty specific. We're looking into a clean energy blueprint for some really hard to reach communities. We're analyzing the potential for swapping out expensive, dirty diesel generators with solar power and battery storage. Now, our main source for this is a paper titled Energy Storage Potential for Solar Based Hybridization of Off Grid Diesel Power Plants in Tanzania. And what's really key here is the date. It's from 2014. That makes its projections, especially around battery costs, really fascinating to look back on now. It gives us a kind of benchmark for how far things have come.
Absolutely. And, the context back then was critical. Rural Tanzania was heavily reliant on these diesel mini grids. And that creates this really tough situation. Super high electricity costs, unreliable power, plus all the pollution, both local and CO2. It really holds back development. The scale of the problem was, well, pretty stark. The national electrification rate was only about 11%, which is already low. But in the rural areas this study focused on, dropped below 2%. So for these communities, diesel often felt like the only option, despite the cost.
Right. So this 2014 study wasn't just talking theory. They actually aimed to identify the specific locations, the real diesel plants out there. And then they wanted to quantify, put real numbers on the potential both technically and economically for bringing in PV and batteries. A proper roadmap. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with, how did they even find these scattered plants?
Yeah, that was the first hurdle. The methodology is quite interesting. They used a geospatial approach, GIS, specifically ArcGIS, back in 2010. Because there wasn't like a central database of all these tiny off-grid plants, they had to define isolated using geography. So their definition was crucial. A plant was isolated if it was outside a 25-kilometer buffer zone around the main national grid. It's a clever way to filter, basically saying, these places aren't getting grid connection anytime soon.
That makes sense. A really practical way to define the scope. So what did that mapping effort turn up? How many sites are we actually talking about?
It gave them a manageable number to focus on for the detailed analysis. They pinpointed 19 specific diesel generators, and these were spread across 9 distinct off-grid locations, mostly in the western and southern parts of mainland Tanzania.
Okay. 19 generators, 9 locations. And what about the total power capacity they represented?
Added together, the installed capacity was 8.89 megawatts, which, for perspective, that's enough to power a small town or maybe a continuous industrial process, a significant load for these isolated areas.
And who was running these? Was it all the state utility or?
That's a great point. Mostly, yes, it was the state-owned utility, Tanesco. That's kind of what you'd expect. But the study found 2 locations, Mbinga and Yarambo, were actually run by private cooperatives.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it highlights that it's not just one single entity you'd be dealing with for these kinds of hybridization projects. There's a mix of operators out there. So once they had the locations pinned down, the next phase was the simulation, the modeling work. They built a model of a PV battery diesel hybrid system to figure out the best mix of components. And the inputs for that model had to be realistic, of course.
Right. We generally know Tanzania has good sun.
Yeah.
How good are we talking for these specific spots? Was solar a limiting factor at all?
Not at all. Solar resource is definitely not the bottleneck here. The global horizontal irradiation, the GHI, was strong. It ranged from about 8,840 up to 2,130 kilowatt hours per square meter per year across these locations. That's, well, fantastic solar potential. More than enough.
Okay, so plenty of sun. Now, the flip side, the diesel cost, that's the big driver for change here, right? What numbers did they plug in?
They used what were, for 2014, very high projected diesel costs, between €1.33 and €1.43 per liter. And that was based on a 20-year forecast, assuming a 2% annual increase. Just think about that, 1.43 a liter. That includes trucking it way out there over rough roads.
Ouch. Yeah, that's cripplingly expensive electricity when you rely on that. And just quickly, the model was PV, battery, diesel. Why leave out wind?
Simple physics, really. The study looked at it, but the average wind speeds in those specific areas were just too low, less than 5 meters per second. You generally need quite a bit more than that for wind turbines to be, cost-effective and reliable. So wind just wasn't a practical option there.
Got it. Okay, that sets the scene perfectly. We've got the isolated sites, great sun, horribly expensive diesel. Now, the crux of it, the storage costs. This is where it gets really interesting, doesn't it? The whole thing seems to pivot on this one factor.
Exactly. The main goal of their simulation was finding the sweet spot, the cost-optimized system. They were looking to minimize the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE, over 20 years. LCOE is basically the average price per kilowatt hour the system needs to earn to break even over its lifetime.
And the key variable they tweaked, the most sensitive one, was the upfront cost of the batteries, the capital expenditure or CapEx.
Precisely. And what they found was really stark. The entire economic case for significant hybridization hung on this surprisingly narrow range for battery costs.
Yeah.
Back in 2014, this study identified that critical threshold as being somewhere between 475 euros per kilowatt hour and 500 euros per kilowatt hour.
Wow. Okay, so just a 25 euros per kilowatt hour window basically decided whether large-scale battery deployment made sense or not. What was the impact? What happened if costs were above 500 euros?
Yes, quite dramatic. Above 500 euro-watt-hour storage just didn't pencil out as too expensive. So the optimal system in that case was just a basic PV diesel hybrid,
Mm.
and you could only get about a 40% share of renewables, maximum. You hit a ceiling, because without storage, you can't use all the solar when it's available.
Right, you need the batteries to shift that solar power, but then if the cost dropped below that 475 euro watt mark.
Then the floodgates opened, essentially. Below that threshold, the model started adding significant amounts of battery storage so it became economically rational. They found that in their lowest cost scenario for batteries, which was an ambitious 100 euro watt hours back then, these hybrid systems could achieve incredibly high renewable shares, up to 92% PV.
92%.
Yeah, it really showed that affordable batteries were the absolute key to deeply cutting diesel use.
And just to give a sense of the total potential across just those 9 locations, if battery costs were low enough, they calculated a maximum potential need for 23.6 milliwatts of PV capacity.
Megawatts peak.
Right, peak solar output, and a corresponding 56.8 milliwatts of battery storage capacity, megawatt hours. That's a lot of batteries for just 9 sites. Which leads us straight to the payoff, right? The savings. If you get to that high solar share, what does it actually mean for the cost of electricity?
Well, when the battery costs were competitive, so below that threshold, the maximum saving on the levelized cost of electricity compared to running purely on diesel was calculated at 17 euro cents per kilowatt hour.
17 cents. That's huge.
It's a massive difference. It makes electricity much more affordable, much more predictable for those communities. But, and this is a really important detail from the paper, for their modeling, they actually simplified things by setting the capital cost and the maintenance costs of the existing diesel generators to zero.
Wait, hang on. They assume the diesel generators cost nothing to buy or maintain.
Effectively, yes, in terms of calculating the savings from the hybrid system. So all those real-world benefits you get from using batteries, like running the diesel generator less often, extending its life, avoiding running it inefficiently at low loads, saving on fuel and maintenance.
All that extra saving wasn't even counted in the 17 cents.
Exactly. Those benefits were not quantified in that headline LCOE saving figure. So the actual real-world economic advantage of the hybrid system would almost certainly be higher than 17 cents per kilowatt.
That's incredible. So the case was even stronger than their main results suggested because they were being conservative about the ongoing costs of sticking with diesel.
Absolutely. And the researchers themselves pointed towards this. They noted that even with battery costs a bit higher than their ideal threshold, say around 300 kilowatt hours, which was still pretty optimistic for 2014, even then, you could get high PV shares, maybe up to 90%, achieve LCOE reductions of maybe 12 euro cents per kilowatt hour, and cut CO2 significantly. The direction of travel was clear even back then.
So if we just summarize the specific market opportunity they identified for those 9 sites, what were the final numbers for the tech needed?
For those specific locations, the total theoretical potential was pegged at 51.1 milliwatt of battery storage and 23.8 milliwatt of PV capacity. It's a defined, specific market segment, but transforming it would have a huge impact locally. And importantly, they predicted correctly, as it turns out that trends like rising diesel costs and falling PV costs would likely push that critical economic threshold for batteries higher than the 500 kilowatt they calculated, making storage even more competitive over time.
Which is exactly what we've seen happen in the last decade. So boiling it all down from this 2014 paper, the key takeaway seems to be that transforming these off-grid systems really pivoted on hitting that battery cost number, around 475 euro watts back then. Below that, diesel's dominance starts to crumble. Now, we focused on those 9 sort of official mini-grid sites, but there's a bigger picture here, isn't there? The final thought we want to leave you with digs into that.
Yeah, exactly. The study itself mentioned data showing that just between 2008 and 2012, Tanzania imported over 118 million US dollars worth of diesel generators.
$118 million. Yeah. And that strongly suggests there's this whole other massive market of smaller, privately owned generators for businesses, lodges, farms, even individual households that weren't part of the main analysis focused on those 9 specific utility or co-op sites.
So if you think about the sheer scale of all those private diesel generators out there, chugging away inefficiently, and then you add back in those unquantified savings, the maintenance, the longer equipment life that the paper didn't even include for the main sites, you have to wonder, right? How much bigger could the true economic and environmental benefits of solar and storage hybridization have been, even back in 2014? It suggests the potential was, and likely still is, just staggering. A really provocative thought to end on. Just to remind you, our source for this deep dive was the paper Energy Storage Potential for Solar-Based Hybridization of Off-Grid Diesel Power Plants in Tanzania. That's all the time we have for today.